I always hated the woods, but irony has a way of laughing in your face. My name is Alex Turner, and if you were to look at me now, you'd never guess I was once a corporate suit in New York City. But that was before it happened, before a single night ripped apart my life and left me not entirely human anymore. It started as a work retreat. You know the type. Lots of awkward team-building exercises in some picturesque mountain cabin. Our boss insisted the solitude would foster camaraderie or some other corporate nonsense. We didn't argue. The place was beautiful, misty peaks, endless green, and air so fresh it felt medicinal. For a guy like me who lived on street hot dogs and coffee fumes, it was a novelty, a short-lived one. On the second night, as my colleagues sat around the fire telling ghost stories, I felt an overwhelming urge to get away. Maybe it was the claustrophobia of forced socializing, or maybe it was the bottle of whiskey I'd shared with HR earlier. I wandered out into the forest, flashlight in hand, its beam carving weak paths through the dark. That's when I heard it, a low, guttural growl. It wasn't like any animal I'd ever heard, more like a dying engine mixed with wet gurgles. My flashlight flickered, and for a second, I thought the batteries were giving out. But the problem wasn't the batteries, it was my hands. They were trembling uncontrollably. I spun around, my flashlight catching glimpses of movement, too fast to follow. A blur of fur. Claws, maybe? My breath came in shallow gasps. I backed up, feeling for the path, but my foot caught on a root, and I went sprawling. The thing stepped into the light. It wasn't a wolf. It was worse, taller than any man, its shoulders hunched grotesquely, formatted with blood and dirt. Yellow eyes burned into me, filled with something far worse than hunger. Malice. It snarled, revealing rows of jagged teeth dripping with saliva. My flashlight slipped from my grasp as I scrambled backward. It lunged. Its claws raked my side, pain erupting like fire. I screamed, a sound that barely escaped my throat before its jaws closed around my arm. Then everything went black. I woke up hours later in the hospital, wrapped in sterile white bandages that couldn't quite contain the horror underneath. My boss had found me bleeding out near the cabin, mumbling incoherently about monsters. The doctors dismissed it as shock, but I knew better. The thing wasn't a figment of my imagination. It had left its mark, a searing bite that throbbed with unnatural heat. The nightmares began almost immediately. Dreams of running under moonlight, my senses heightened to an unbearable degree. I could smell the decay of leaves, hear the distant rustle of prey, and when I woke up, my body ached like I'd sprinted for miles. Worse, my appetite changed. I craved meat, raw, bloody. My fridge's chicken breasts didn't cut it. They tasted like ash. I started to notice the other changes too. My strength doubled, then tripled. Once, out of frustration, I slammed my fist against the bathroom counter, shattering it into porcelain shards. My reflection was unrecognizable, paler, gaunt, with eyes that gleamed faintly in the dark. I avoided mirrors after that. Then came the first full moon. I didn't understand what was happening at first. I thought the fever was from an infection. My whole body burned as if every cell inside me was being torn apart and rebuilt. My skin stretched, bones cracked, and the howl that ripped from my throat wasn't human. My mind, my humanity, faded into a feral haze. I remember running, tearing through the streets of my small suburban neighborhood, and the smell of fear as people locked their doors too late. When I woke up the next morning, I was naked in a field miles away, my body caked in dirt and blood. None of it was mine. Waking up in that field was just the beginning. I lay there for what felt like hours, too afraid to move. The blood on my hands, sticky and congealed, felt heavier than my limbs. My stomach churned with nausea, but deep inside, another part of me, the beast, felt sated. I gagged, willing the bile to stay down as fragments of the night clawed their way into my consciousness. I remember to scream, high-pitched, human. By the time I staggered back to my house, the streets were eerily quiet. It was early, too early for the neighborhood to be this lifeless. As I passed Mrs. Green's yard, I noticed her prized rose bushes were trampled. Bloody paw prints led up to her porch. The thought that I might have caused it made my vision blur. Inside, the house felt alien, like I didn't belong anymore. I headed straight for the shower, scrubbing myself raw, but the blood felt embedded in my skin. My reflection in the foggy mirror stared back at me with hollow eyes, rimmed red from exhaustion, and something darker, something feral. The TV confirmed my worst fears. Local woman found dead in yard, the anchor announced, his voice detached and professional. My stomach dropped. The picture that flashed across the screen was Mrs. Green. Her face, once kind, always smiling, was now a stark reminder of what I had become. The police were investigating it as an animal attack. They weren't wrong. I spent the rest of the day hiding. Curtains drawn, phone silenced, pacing like a caged animal. I should have felt grief or guilt, but instead, there was something else beneath the surface, a sickening pride. My body hummed with leftover adrenaline, as if it relished the violence. Every time I tried to think clearly, the beast within me snarled in defiance, urging me to embrace what I had become. That night, I chained myself to the radiator. The full moon wasn't due to rise again for a while, but I wasn't taking any chances. I barely slept, jumping at every sound outside. The shadows felt alive, dancing with threats I couldn't see. My neighbors, their faces pressed against glass windows as they peeked out into the dark, probably didn't sleep either. By morning, I was at my wit's end. I needed answers. There had to be someone who could explain what was happening to me, someone who could stop it. My first instinct was the internet. I sifted through forums, scrolling past endless pages of conspiracy theories and stories that felt more like bad fanfiction than actual advice. But one comment stuck out. It was buried in a thread titled, "Have you seen the moon?" A user named Lycos112 had written, "This isn't a curse. It's a choice. Embrace it, or we'll destroy you." He'd added a location, Wolf Creek, Colorado. The town was as remote as it sounded, more of a settlement than a real place. It took 2 days of driving to get there, and every mile felt heavier, like I was dragging the weight of my sins behind me. My old car wheezed up the gravel roads, and when I finally arrived, the sight of the town sent a shiver down my spine. Wolf Creek looked abandoned. Most of the buildings were crumbling, overtaken by vines and rot. But there were signs of life. Fresh tire tracks in the dirt, faint smoke rising from a chimney. I parked outside the general store, or what was left of it, and stepped into the eerie stillness. Looking for something? The voice startled me. An old man leaned against the doorway, his eyes sharp despite the deep lines on his face. He didn't wait for me to answer. "You've got the look of someone running from something," he said, his lips curling into a humorless smile. "But you're not running from it, are you? You're running with it." I froze. "I'm here to find someone I managed." Lycos112? He laughed, a dry, rasping sound. "You found him." His name was Jonas, and he wasn't just a werewolf. He was the leader of a pack. As night fell, he led me to a secluded clearing where a group of people waited around a fire. They were all different, young and old, some polished and city-like, others rugged and wild. But their eyes gleamed with the same yellow hue I'd seen in the mirror. Jonas motioned for me to sit. "We all start the same way," he began, his voice carrying an unsettling calm. "The fear, the guilt, the denial. But the truth, Alex, is that the wolf inside you isn't the enemy. You are." He spoke of balance, of learning to coexist with the beast rather than suppress it. The others nodded, murmuring in agreement. They told stories of their first kills, their struggles, and ultimately their acceptance. But every word made my skin crawl. I didn't want to coexist with the thing that had killed Mrs. Green. I wanted it gone. When I told them this, Jonas frowned. "You can't fight it forever," he said. "The wolf is part of you now. If you try to destroy it, you'll destroy yourself." Despite his warnings, I couldn't let go of my humanity. I stayed in Wolf Creek for a week, learning what I could, but my resolve never wavered. On the last night, under a waxing moon, Jonas took me aside. "There's an old legend," he said, his tone heavy with reluctance. "Some say the bite can be reversed, but it's risky, and the cost, well, you might not survive." "I don't care," I said. "Tell me." He sighed. "There's a ritual. You need the blood of the one who turned you, and you need to perform it under the next full moon." The memory of the creature flashed in my mind. The yellow eyes, the jagged teeth. I didn't know how to find it, let alone kill it. But I had no choice. As I drove back to my empty house, the weight of Jonas's words pressed down on me. The next full moon was only days away, and if I failed, I'd lose more than just control. I'd lose myself entirely. But deep down, a part of me, the part one hated, wasn't afraid of failing. It was afraid of succeeding, because the beast didn't want to leave. By the time I reached home, the sky was already streaked with the fiery hues of twilight. My hands trembled on the steering wheel, and my thoughts churned with fear and determination. The full moon was rising tonight, and I had no idea how I'd survive the transformation, let alone track down the creature that had cursed me. I locked every door and window in the house, then barricaded myself in the basement. It was a vain attempt to protect anyone nearby from what I might become. My heart thundered as I chained my arms and legs to a metal pipe anchored in the concrete wall. The bite wound on my side burned like molten steel, pulsing in rhythm with my heartbeat. I checked the clock, 8:45 p.m. The moon would rise fully by 9. My breath came in shallow gasps as I leaned my head back against the damp wall, praying for strength. The first wave hit at 8:52. It started in my chest, an ache so deep and fierce it felt like my ribs were being pried apart from the inside. My body convulsed, the chains rattling as I writhed against the cold, unforgiving concrete. My vision blurred, and my muscles burned with an intensity I'd never known. I screamed, a guttural, animalistic sound that echoed off the basement walls. My hands twisted against the chains, my nails digging into the flesh of my palms. Then I felt it, the unmistakable snap of bones breaking and realigning. My fingers stretched, elongating into claws, my skin splitting to reveal thick tufts of fur beneath. My senses sharpened. The basement's musty stench became overwhelming, mingling with the faint scent of something alive. My ears picked up distant noises, the hum of a neighbor's TV, a dog barking 2 blocks away, the skittering of a rat in the walls. My heart pounded with the thrill of it, a wild exhilaration that drowned out my human thoughts. But it wasn't just my body that was changing. My mind fractured, a darker presence rising to the surface. The beast. It growled in the back of my head, a deep, feral voice urging me to embrace the hunt, to run, to kill. I fought it. My humanity was slipping through my fingers like sand, but I clung to it with everything I had. The chains dug into my wrists as I thrashed, the pipe groaning under the strain. Then the moonlight touched me. The faint light streaming through the small basement window seemed to ignite something deep within me. Pain gave way to an intoxicating surge of power. The chains snapped with a metallic clang, and I fell to the floor on all fours, panting. My reflection in the cracked basement mirror stopped me cold. It wasn't my face staring back. Yellow eyes glowed like embers beneath a heavy brow. My jaw stretched unnaturally wide, lined with sharp, gleaming teeth. My entire body was covered in coarse black fur, muscles rippling with unnatural strength. I was a wolf, but not entirely. The grotesque hybrid form I had taken was something out of nightmares. The beast took control. I burst through the basement door, tearing through the house with reckless abandon. The front door shattered beneath my weight as I lunged into the cool night air. The world outside was vibrant and alive, every sound and smell amplified to an overwhelming degree. The scent of prey filled my nostrils, squirrels, raccoons, and something richer, something human. I sprinted through the neighborhood, leaping over fences and darting between shadows. The beast relished the freedom, the primal joy of the hunt. A woman's laughter rang out from a nearby yard, and my ears swiveled toward the sound. I caught a glimpse of her through the trees, young, smiling, oblivious to the monster stalking her. No! The human part of me screamed in protest, clawing its way to the surface. I skidded to a halt, my claws gouging the dirt. The beast snarled, furious at my defiance. My head throbbed as the two halves of me fought for dominance. I howled, a piercing cry of anguish that split the night. Before I could lose myself entirely, another howl answered, deep, resonant, and close. My ears twitched as I turned toward the sound. It came from the woods at the edge of town. The beast within me recognized it instantly. The alpha, the one who had turned me. Compelled by an instinct I didn't understand, I charged toward the source. The trees closed in around me, their shadows stretching like claws. The scent of blood and musk grew stronger with each step. Then I saw it, a hulking figure standing in a clearing bathed in silver light. It was even more monstrous than I remembered. The alpha's fur was matted with dried blood, its eyes burning with the same yellow fire as mine. It towered over me, its breath steaming in the cool air. For a moment, the beast inside me bowed in submission, but the human part of me burned with rage. This was the creature that had cursed me, that had killed Mrs. Green, that had turned my life into a waking nightmare. I lunged. The fight was brutal, a blur of teeth and claws, snarls and roars. The alpha was faster, stronger, but I was fueled by desperation. My claws raked its side, and it retaliated with a swipe that sent me crashing into a tree. Pain flared in my ribs, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. We clashed again, rolling through the dirt in a tangle of fur and blood. The alpha's jaws closed around my shoulder, and I howled in agony. But as its teeth sank deeper, something inside me snapped. The beast surged forward, overpowering my human thoughts entirely. With a strength I didn't know I possessed, I tore free and sank my fangs into the alpha's throat. It thrashed wildly, but I held on, the taste of its blood igniting a fire in my veins. Finally, it went limp, collapsing to the ground. I staggered back, panting, as the alpha's body began to shift. Its monstrous form melted away, revealing a man, weathered, scarred, and unmistakably human. His eyes met mine one last time, filled with a strange mix of hatred and relief, before they closed forever. As the moonlight faded, my body began to change again. Fur receded, claws dulled, and the beast's roar quieted to a whisper. I collapsed to the ground, naked and trembling, the weight of what I'd done pressing down on me like a mountain. I had killed the alpha, but the curse wasn't gone. It was part of me now, forever. Dawn broke through the trees, painting the forest in shades of amber and gold. I lay on the ground, every muscle in my body aching as the adrenaline of the fight ebbed away. The metallic taste of blood lingered in my mouth, and my skin was slick with it, both mine and his. I didn't want to look at the body, but I had to, forcing myself upright. I crawled toward the lifeless form of the alpha. His human shape was a stark contrast to the hulking beast he'd been just hours ago. His chest, broad and scarred, no longer rose with breath. His face was rough, lined with years of life, but familiar, too familiar. It was Eric Monroe, my childhood friend. I gasped, falling back as the recognition hit me like a freight train. Eric had been my closest friend growing up, practically a brother to me. We'd spent summers building forts, daring each other to climb the tallest trees, and sneaking out to camp under the stars. But life had taken us down different paths. Eric had stayed in our small town, finding work as a mechanic, while I'd left for the big city in pursuit of ambition and success. We hadn't spoken in years, and now, here he was lying dead at my feet, his blood staining my hands. How had it come to this? I reached out with a trembling hand, touching his cold shoulder. Memories flooded back, his loud, boisterous laugh, the way he always stood up for me when bullies came around, the nights we spent planning futures we'd never live. I'd killed him, the weight of my guilt pressed down like a lead blanket. Tears stung my eyes, but before they could fall, a rustling sound snapped me back to the present. I whipped around, my heart pounding. The forest was eerily silent except for the faint rustle of leaves. I wasn't alone. Who's there? I croaked, my voice barely audible. My throat felt raw, as though I'd been screaming all night. A figure emerged from the shadows, her face framed by long, dark hair. Her eyes glowed faintly in the dim light, a telltale sign that she wasn't entirely human. "Stay back," I warned, though I doubted I had the strength to fight anymore. She raised her hands in a gesture of peace. "I'm not here to hurt you," she said, her voice low and steady. "My name's Mara. I was part of Eric's pack." The word pack sent a chill down my spine. Of course, Eric wasn't alone. Werewolves traveled in groups, or so Jonas had told me. My stomach twisted at the thought of what this might mean. Mara stepped closer, her expression unreadable. "You didn't know, did you?" she asked, nodding toward Eric's body. I shook my head, unable to form words. She crouched beside him, her fingers brushing his bloodied cheek. For a moment, she was silent. Then she looked at me, her glowing eyes filled with something between anger and pity. "He didn't want this for you," she said. "He never wanted you to be dragged into this life." I stared at her, the words barely registering. "What are you talking about?" I finally managed. Mara sighed, standing up. She towered over me, her presence as commanding as the alpha I'd just killed. "Eric turned you. He didn't have a choice. He said he found you in the woods, bleeding out. You've been attacked by another wolf, one that wasn't part of our pack." Her words were like a dagger to the chest. "He saved me?" I whispered. "Yes," Mara said, her tone softening. "The bite was the only way to keep you alive. But it wasn't just to save your life. He hoped you might join us." I shook my head violently. "No, that's not true. Eric wouldn't do this to me. He wouldn't curse me like this." "It wasn't a curse to him," she said quietly. "He thought it was a gift. But you fought him, didn't you? When the beast took over, you didn't recognize him." Her gaze dropped to Eric's body, then back to me. "You killed him because you didn't know." I wanted to scream, to tear at the forest floor, to make it all go away. Eric had been trying to save me, and in my blind rage, I destroyed him. My stomach churned with nausea, and I doubled over, retching into the dirt. Mara didn't move, didn't speak. When I finally stopped, I looked up at her, my vision blurred by tears. "What now?" I asked, my voice hoarse. "I've killed him. Isn't that what you do to the alpha?" "Yes," she said simply. "And now, the pack is yours." The words hit me like a hammer. "No," I said, shaking my head. "No, I don't want this. I'm not a leader. I'm not even one of you." Mara tilted her head, studying me. "You are, whether you like it or not. The moment you killed Eric, the mantle passed to you. It's the law of our kind." "I didn't ask for this," I said, my voice breaking. "Neither did he," she shot back. "But he made the best of it. And now, so will you." She stood and turned to leave, her figure disappearing into the trees. "The pack will find you," she said over her shoulder. "They'll need your guidance. Whether you accept it or not, you're one of us now." I sat there long after she was gone, staring at Eric's body. My mind swirled with questions, regrets, and a rage I didn't know how to direct. The alpha was dead, but the beast wasn't gone. It was part of me now, and so was the pack. The sun climbed higher, but its light brought no warmth, only shadows. The days following Eric's death blurred together, a haze of guilt, confusion, and simmering rage. I stayed away from people, haunted by the knowledge of what I'd done. His blood was on my hands, literally, and no amount of scrubbing could erase the memory of it. But something deeper was changing. The more I tried to ignore it, the more it pushed to the forefront. My senses, heightened during the full moon, didn't fade completely. I could smell rain hours before it arrived, hear distant conversations through closed windows, and my strength bordered on inhuman. I avoided mirrors entirely, terrified of what I'd see. Then they came for me. It started with the scent, earthy and sharp, like pine needles crushed underfoot. I knew someone was near before I heard the quiet knock on my door. My heart raced as I opened it, already guessing who I'd find. Mara stood on the porch, her face unreadable. Behind her, 3 others lingered in the shadows, their eyes glowing faintly in the dim evening light. "You've been avoiding us," Mara said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "I didn't ask for this. I shot back, my voice rough. You think any of us did? She retorted. The moment you killed Eric, you became part of something bigger. You can't just walk away. I glanced at the others outside. They were watching me with expressions I couldn't quite place. Wary, curious, but not hostile. Yet, what do you want from me? I asked. You're the alpha now, Mara said, crossing her arms. Whether you like it or not, they're looking to you for leadership, for guidance. Eric believed in you, even if you don't believe in yourself. Her words hit a nerve. I thought of Eric's face, the shock and sadness in his eyes as he died. He had trusted me, even as I tore him apart. I clenched my fists, the guilt threatening to choke me. I'm not a leader, I said. Mara's expression softened, but only slightly. You are now, and if you don't step up, this pack will fall apart. When a pack loses its alpha, it creates a vacuum. Rival packs, lone wolves, they'll come for us. For you. If we're not united, we'll be wiped out. The weight of her words sank in. I didn't know anything about leading a pack, but I knew about survival. And right now, it seemed like our lives depended on me pretending I had a clue. I nodded reluctantly. Fine, but I need to know the truth. About Eric. About all of this. Mara motioned for the others to join us. They entered hesitantly, each one sizing me up as they crossed the threshold. There were three: a lanky young man with a nervous energy, a stoic woman with piercing eyes, and a burly guy who looked like he could snap me in half. This is David, Cass, and Mark, Mara said, gesturing to each in turn. They're what's left of the pack. What's left? I asked. Eric kept us small for a reason, Mara said. A bigger pack attracts more attention, more threats. He was careful about who he brought in. I glanced at the others, wondering how they fit into all of this. David avoided my gaze, fidgeting with the hem of his jacket. Cass stared at me with a mix of distrust and challenge, while Mark crossed his arms, his expression unreadable. What happens now? I asked. That depends on you, Mara said. But first, we need to know if you're going to run or if you're going to fight. That night, they took me deep into the woods, to a clearing bathed in moonlight. The air was thick with tension, every sound amplified by the silence that stretched between us. This is where we meet, Mara explained, where Eric taught us what it means to be pack. It's sacred ground. I stood at the edge of the clearing, feeling out of place among them. They moved with an ease and confidence I couldn't mimic, their bond evident in the way they fell into step with one another. I was the outsider, the usurper, and they all knew it. Mara stepped into the center of the clearing and turned to face me. This is your chance to prove yourself, she said. If you're going to lead us, we need to see your strength, your commitment. My stomach churned. And how do I do that? She pointed to Mark, the burly one. He stepped forward, cracking his knuckles. You fight, she said simply. The fight was brutal. Mark didn't hold back, and neither could I. He came at me like a freight train, his fists landing with enough force to rattle my teeth. I ducked, dodged, and countered as best I could, but he was faster and stronger than I expected. My human instinct screamed at me to run, but the wolf inside me roared to life. With a growl that didn't feel entirely mine, I lunged at Mark, tackling him to the ground. My claws, when did they come out, raked across his arm, drawing blood. He snarled, flipping me onto my back with a strength that defied physics. The others watched silently, their expressions unreadable. This wasn't just a fight, it was a test, and I was failing. Desperation fueled me. I lashed out, my movements becoming more animalistic, more instinctive. I wasn't Alex anymore, not entirely. I was something else, something feral. With a final burst of strength, I pinned Mark to the ground, my teeth bared inches from his throat. He went still, his chest heaving. For a moment, the forest was silent. Enough, Mara said, stepping forward. Her voice was calm, but it carried an authority I couldn't ignore. You've proven yourself. I released Mark and staggered back, my breath ragged. The others nodded, their expressions shifting from skepticism to cautious respect. You fought like an alpha, Mara said. Now it's time to act like one. As the adrenaline faded, I looked around the clearing, at the people who were now my responsibility. I didn't know if I could be what they needed, but I had no choice. The beast inside me wouldn't let me walk away, and neither would they. Eric's voice echoed in my mind, a memory of his laughter, his trust. I had killed him, but maybe, just maybe, I could honor his legacy. The pack was mine now, and I'd fight to protect it, even if it destroyed me in the process. The days after the fight blurred into restless nights and uneasy alliances. The pack began to treat me as their alpha, but their eyes still held questions, doubts. Mara was the only one who seemed confident I could handle the role, but even her faith felt conditional. And as much as I wanted to rise to their expectations, something darker lingered in the back of my mind. The forest had never felt so alive. Every night, the air seemed charged, whispers carried on the wind. I heard things that couldn't be there. Low growls, distant laughter, and the unmistakable sound of footsteps pacing just outside my door. At first, I thought it was paranoia, but the others felt it too. Something was out there, and it was watching us. One night, Mara called a meeting in a clearing. The moon was nearly full, casting long shadows that danced between the trees. The pack was tense, their postures stiff, their movements cautious. "We're being hunted," Mara said, her voice steady despite the weight of her words. David shifted uneasily, his lanky frame trembling. "Hunted by what?" he asked, his voice cracking. "Not what," Cass said, her sharp eyes scanning the darkness. "Who?" My stomach churned. I'd heard of hunters. Humans who knew about werewolves and saw it as their duty to eradicate us. But the way Cass said it, there was something more sinister behind her words. "Eric warned us about them," Mara continued. "There's a group, old, ruthless, and relentless. They call themselves the Hollow Men." "The Hollow Men?" I asked, the name unfamiliar yet ominous. "They're not just hunters," she said. "There's something worse. They don't just kill wolves. They twist them, break them. They turn the beast inside us against our humanity." The pack grew silent, the weight of her words settling over us like a suffocating fog. Mark, who rarely spoke, broke the silence. "We should run," he said, his deep voice carrying a rare note of fear. "No," I said, surprising even myself. The word left my mouth before I could think, but it felt right. "We don't run. If we run, we'll be hunted down, one by one. We fight." The others exchanged uneasy glances, but no one argued. Mara nodded, a faint glimmer of approval in her eyes. "Then we need to prepare," she said, "and we need to do it fast. The Hollow Men don't leave survivors." That night, I stayed awake, keeping watch while the others rested. The forest was eerily quiet, the usual symphony of crickets and rustling leaves replaced by an impressive stillness. The wind carried a faint, metallic scent that made my skin crawl. Then I heard it, a howl low, mournful, and impossibly close. It wasn't one of ours. My pulse quickened as I strained my ears, listening for movement. Another sound followed, a wet, slithering noise, like something being dragged through the underbrush. I stood, my claws extending instinctively. "Who's there?" I called, my voice echoing through the trees. The darkness answered with a chilling laugh, hollow and distorted, like it was coming from every direction at once. "They're here," Mara's voice whispered from behind me. I turned to see her standing in the shadows, her eyes glowing faintly. "Get the others." Before I could move, a figure emerged from the trees. It was tall and gaunt, its face obscured by a mask that looked carved from bone. In its hand, it held a long, curved blade that shimmered faintly in the moonlight. The Hollow Man. My instinct screamed at me to attack, but the moment I took a step forward, more figures appeared, their masks pale and grotesque. They moved silently, surrounding us in a circle of cold, unyielding menace. The pack burst from the underbrush, their snarls breaking the silence. David and Cass flanked me, their forms already shifting, fur bristling as they prepared for a fight. Mark let out a guttural roar, charging at one of the Hollow Men. It was a mistake. The Hollow Man didn't flinch as Mark lunged. With a single fluid motion, it raised its blade and struck. The sound was sickening, a wet crunch as the blade pierced Mark's chest. He collapsed, his growl turning into a whimper as blood pooled beneath him. I roared, the beast within me surging to the surface. The fight erupted into chaos. The hollow men moved like shadows, their blades flashing in the moonlight. The pack fought fiercely, their claws tearing through flesh, their howls shaking the trees. But for every hollow man that fell, another seemed to take its place. Mara fought beside me, her movements precise and deadly. But even she was struggling to keep up with the sheer number of them. "They're not human," she growled, her voice strained. "There's something else." I didn't have time to process her words. One of the hollow men lunged at me, its blade slicing through the air. I dodged, the edge grazing my arm, leaving a burning sensation in its wake. My claws found its chest, ripping through fabric and flesh. It fell with a guttural hiss, its mask cracking to reveal a face that was wrong. The features were human, but distorted, as though molded by hands that didn't quite understand humanity. Its eyes were black pits, its mouth twisted into a grotesque grin. "What are you?" I whispered, my stomach churning. It didn't answer. Instead, it let out a blood-curdling scream that echoed through the forest. The scream seemed to paralyze the pack. David froze mid-attack, his eyes wide with terror. Cass stumbled, clutching her head as though trying to block out the sound. Even Mara faltered, her movements slowing. I felt it too, a cold, creeping dread that seeped into my bones. But something deeper stirred within me. The beast. It roared against the paralysis, its anger burning away the fear. With a guttural snarl, I charged the hollow man, my claws sinking into its neck. Its scream cut off abruptly as I tore it apart, black ichor spilling onto the forest floor. The others snapped out of their trance, their movements renewed with ferocity. The tide of the battle shifted, but it wasn't enough. The hollow men kept coming, their numbers seemingly endless. Then I saw him. A figure stood at the edge of the clearing, taller than the rest, his mask more ornate. The leader. He watched the chaos with a calm, unnerving stillness, his black eyes locked on mine. The beast within me surged forward, drawn to him like a moth to flame. I didn't think. I ran, my claws bared, my teeth ready to tear. As I lunged, he raised his hand. The air seemed to ripple around him, and an invisible force slammed into me, sending me crashing to the ground. "Foolish," he said, his voice hollow and echoing. "You cannot fight what you do not understand." He stepped closer, his shadow falling over me. "You think you're their leader?" he said, his voice dripping with disdain. "You're nothing but a fledgling, clinging to power you don't deserve." Rage burned through me, overpowering the pain. I forced myself to my feet, the beast roaring in defiance. "I'm not afraid of you," I growled. His twisted grin widened. "You will be." The last thing I saw was his blade, glinting in the moonlight, before darkness consumed me. When I opened my eyes, the world was a blur. The forest loomed above me, its branches tangled like the ribs of some enormous beast. My body throbbed with pain, but the worst was the cold, a deep, bone-chilling cold that seemed to radiate from inside me. I tried to move, but chains bit into my wrists and ankles, holding me against the forest floor. The hollow men stood in a circle around me, their bone masks glowing faintly in the pale moonlight. The leader loomed above me, his presence oppressive and suffocating. "You survived the first mark," he said, his voice hollow. "Impressive. Most don't." "The first mark?" I croaked, my throat dry and raw. He crouched beside me, his mask inches from my face. "The blade I struck you with, it carries the essence of our curse. A deeper poison than what the wolf inside you already knows. It separates the beast from the man, turning one against the other." I felt it then, the thing he described, a fracture deep within me, as though the wolf and I were no longer one. My thoughts were tangled, my instincts a violent, foreign thing clawing at the edges of my mind. "What do you want?" I growled. The leader tilted his head, his expression unreadable behind the mask. "We want what we've always wanted, to control the wolf, to make it ours. And to do that, we need alphas, leaders like you." His words cut through the haze, igniting a spark of defiance. "I'll never help you," I spat. "You won't have a choice," he replied. "The curse will break you. It always does." Behind him, the other hollow men began a low, guttural chant. The air grew heavy, vibrating with an unnatural energy. My vision swam as the poison in my veins seemed to pulse in rhythm with their voices. I struggled against the chains, but my strength was gone. The beast inside me thrashed wildly, its anger fueling my desperation, but it was like fighting a storm with bare hands. I was drowning in its fury. Then a familiar voice cut through the darkness. "Get away from him." The chanting stopped abruptly as Mara burst into the clearing, flanked by David and Cass. They moved like a unit, their eyes glowing with a shared determination. "Ah," the leader said, rising to his full height. "The remnants of your pack. How noble." Mara didn't hesitate. She lunged at the nearest hollow man, her claws slashing through his torso. David and Cass followed, their snarls tearing through the night as they engaged the others. The forest erupted into chaos. I struggled against my chains, the beast inside me howling in frustration. "Mara," I shouted. She glanced at me, her eyes fierce. "Hold on," she said, her voice strained as she fought off a hollow man's blade. The leader stepped back, watching the fight with an almost amused detachment. "They'll die for you, you know," he said, his voice calm. "And when they're gone, you'll be alone. Just like Eric." His words hit a nerve, but they also fueled my resolve. I wouldn't let my pack suffer because of me. I wouldn't let Eric's death be for nothing. With a surge of anger, I pulled against the chains, the metal cutting into my wrists. The beast within me snarled, its rage mingling with mine. For a moment, we were united, our hatred burning through the fracture. My muscles tensed, and with a guttural roar, I tore the chains free. The leader turned to me, his head tilting in mild surprise. "Interesting," he said. I didn't give him time to react. I charged, my claws slashing at his chest. He moved with inhuman speed, dodging my attack and striking back with his blade. I barely avoided the blow, the edge grazing my side. "You can't win," he said, his tone almost pitying. "The wolf will betray you. It always does." His words echoed in my mind as we fought, his blade clashing against my claws. He was stronger, faster, and his strikes were calculated to exploit my hesitation. But every time I faltered, I thought of Eric, of the pack, of the lives I'd already taken and the ones I still needed to protect. The beast within me roared, its presence overwhelming. My vision blurred, the forest fading into a haze of red. I felt my body shift, my human thoughts slipping away as the wolf took control. The leader laughed, a chilling sound that grated against my ears. "Yes," he said, "let it consume you. Let it." I didn't let him finish. The wolf lunged, its jaws closing around his arm. The bone mass cracked as he snarled, his blade dropping to the ground. The wolf was relentless, its teeth tearing into him with a ferocity I couldn't have summoned alone. The other hollow men faltered, their connection to their leader weakening. Mara and the pack took advantage, driving them back with savage efficiency. But something was wrong. The wolf inside me wasn't stopping. It tore into the leader, its rage blinding and uncontrollable. I tried to pull back, to reclaim control, but the fracture in my mind yawned wide, and I realized with horror that I was losing. "Alex," Mara's voice cut through the haze. "You're killing yourself." Her words didn't make sense until I looked down. The leader's body was crumbling into ash, his essence seeping into my skin. The curse was spreading, the poison consuming me. I stumbled back, the wolf howling in agony as the fracture deepened. My body felt like it was tearing itself apart. Mara was at my side in an instant, her hands on my shoulders. "You have to fight it," she said, her voice urgent. "You're the alpha. The pack needs you." Her words were a lifeline, pulling me back from the edge. I closed my eyes, focusing on the bond once shared with the pack. I could feel them, Mara, David, Cass, their strength, their loyalty. They weren't just following me. They were with me. I reached for the beast, not to suppress it, but to join it, to make it part of me again. With a final, agonized roar, I reclaimed control. When I opened my eyes, the clearing was still. The hollow men were gone, their masks shattered and their bodies reduced to ash. The pack stood together, their faces etched with exhaustion and relief. Mara helped me to my feet, her eyes searching mine. "You did it," she said. I nodded, my body trembling. "We did it," I corrected. The forest was quiet again, but the silence was different this time. It wasn't oppressive. It was peaceful. The pack gathered around me, their presence a reminder that I wasn't alone. We had survived. We had fought. And now, we would heal. As the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't just the alpha. I was part of something bigger, something worth fighting for. The beast inside me growled, but this time, it wasn't a threat. It was a promise.